Okay, we are live, so I will get us underway and then try to ignore all of the technology around me. I'm speaking today with Fed Sanchez, who is a Torontonian who has a New York Times subscription, and as such, he's been involved in a project that they have going on called Times Machine. Welcome, Fed.
Hello.
What you have been doing is the Times Machine is an archive of the New York Times, and you've been going back and reading exactly 100-year-old newspapers, and as I understand it, you've been doing that since last December as a way of immersing yourself in the lead up to and the beginning stages of World War I. What prompted you to take this approach to learning about that period of our history?
Well, I've been interested in World War One for quite a while, and so is my wife, actually. I'm pretty lucky in that regard. And then when we were going to various museums and seeing various things, I just noticed that there's just so much information. It's impossible to get all of it from a book. So I figured the best way would be just to walk through it on a daily basis and to see what it would be like to actually live through it from somebody who's on this side of the Atlantic, and reading from the papers and just getting all the details that way, just to kind of immerse yourself into the process.
Right. Why did you decide to start well before the beginning of the war, back in December of 2013? So I know that you occasionally talk about the war in the present tense. So in 1913.
Yeah. Well, I kind of figured that I should know the background of what's actually happening at the time when the war broke out, because I thought maybe just starting in on the war would just be very, isolated. I wanted to kind of figure out what was happening politically, socially, economically, at the time, to get the context of what people were living through or what life was like 100 years ago before the war came and changed all that.
And what sort of insights have you gained into that period that you hadn't understood previously?
Prior to the war, I had no idea that globalization was such a huge thing back then. In fact, some people will even say that they were more globally connected than we are today. Of course, ignoring the internet and other obvious things like that. But from trade, the first thing I noticed when the war started was the gears of the global trade gearing down. It took a long time. They were very well connected. I had no idea that had been the case.
Now, once we get into the war, you said that both you and your wife had a fairly good understanding of that period of history, but what are some of the surprising things that you have learned about the war that have come as insights through this project?
Well, I guess probably one of the biggest ones is I thought that World War I was, a war between empires, a war between rulers, and as opposed to World War II, which we consider to be a just war. When I look at it now, I see what happened with Germany in World War I and World War II as being pretty well the same war. So I do consider World War I to be a just war now that I've seen, how the interplay between the countries played out.
I think you mentioned when we first spoke about this, something about insights into Belgium's role in the war.
Right, that was a huge surprise as well. Because when we were in Belgium, we spoke to Belgians, and they were very humble about the whole thing, and how their forts didn't hold out for very long, and how their defense was more or less useless. Was the impression I was getting from a lot of Belgians, and that's just 100% false. The Belgians managed to hold back the Germans for a significant amount of time, considering the machinery they were up against. I think it was about 2 weeks, or for Liège, and then all told probably about 3 or more weeks, which gave enough time for France to mobilize and for England to get over into Europe and hold the Germans back to where they did. If it wasn't for the Belgians, I'm pretty sure that the Germans probably would have made it to Paris and beyond.
Now, one of the things that I found interesting when you first mentioned this project to me is that you are seeing the war through an American lens with the New York Times. What do you think you gain as a Canadian by having that view of the war?
Um, well, the biggest thing I'd say is the neutrality of the United States at the time. Um, Canada was, of course, a part of the Dominion of Canada, part of England's extended empire. As such, there was a significant censorship in Canada. I did look at the Toronto Star, and yeah, it was mostly official dispatches and stories that were obviously censored. In the United States, they do have censorship because the stories coming in have to go through the States or go through France, but they do mark the passages that were censored, and they do write articles in the United States that are not censored. So you do get a very neutral perspective that way. Also, I have to say that the writing of the New York Times was really spectacular back then. It's really quite a joy to read some of these articles. They read like stories or books, short stories. You got to wonder how much embellishment's going on, but it's definitely entertaining.
Is there a Canadian story that has been told in the Times that you found particularly interesting?
Probably the one I find the most interesting is when so many volunteers enlisted when the call went out that the Canadian military had to put the brakes on. They decided the way to do it was to make it mandatory for married men to bring in a written letter saying from their wife saying that they're allowed to join the army. That kind of backfired because in the end, not enough wives consented, and so the enlistment dropped off a little bit more than they predicted. But I thought that was a very bizarre thing that the government did.
And I think you also mentioned to me a story that you had run across, and you gave me a graphic of that, which will be as part of the blog, about the number of Americans who were coming north of the border to join in the fight.
Right. I think that the amount of Canadians that enlisted was 30 to 60,000, and then the Americans was 200,000 that were coming over to Canada and wanting to enlist.
And is there a particular aspect of the war that you want to be able to follow through the entirety of this project? I would imagine, there are certain interests that you have that are played out in the newspaper.
Right. There's actually two themes. One is aviation. That's a personal interest of mine. It has been for a very long time, and the change between the monoplanes and biplanes at the beginning of the war, which they could barely maneuver, to what was occurring at the end of the war, where they had pretty well the full gamut of World War II, except on a slower, less dangerous scale. It's just fascinating how fast things moved. But I'd say the thing that I found most surprising and that I would want to follow that I didn't consider before was the neutrality issues surrounding the global war. The United States is making a very serious attempt to stay neutral for various reasons. They do have a lot of elements of all the belligerents in their country, so I'm sure they want to maintain internal peace that way. But also other countries like Holland at this point is still neutral, and Sweden and various other countries, and Turkey has just recently joined on the German side. But the way that their neutrality was playing out beforehand, it's all very interesting because it's ruled by convention, the Hague Convention and some Geneva conventions, and they try to stick to it. And some of the things that they're doing is I wouldn't have expected, and I'm interested to see how the Americans are going to stick to this when they get up to where they're joining the war, and how things change in the press at that point.
You mentioned Turkey, and I know when we were speaking about this before, you said that had had an impact in terms of the way that the Indian Army managed to get to the front, and there's a Canadian connection there. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
That's right. The English didn't want to use the Suez Canal for fear of getting trapped there because they weren't sure which way Turkey was going to go. So they decided to send the Indian troops through the Pacific, over to Vancouver. And then they landed. They had to clear the railway so that nobody would see them, and then they put them on a and this amount, I think, is about 30 or 40,000 troops. They put them on the trains and had them shut the blinds so that nobody could see them all the way across Canada. Got over to, I believe, Montreal, and then got on a boat and went to England from there. And it only came out in the press when they got to England that they had ever been in Canada. They managed to do it in total secrecy.
Well, I would imagine that there are lots more interesting stories that you'll discover as the war continues. How much of your time are you putting into this each day?
Well, that's a bit of a problem. At first, it was only really an hour and a half a day. And then when the war broke out, you know, the coverage was so immense. I was trying to read everything. I was up to about 4 or 5 hours a day, and I've had to cut back recently because that's a bit too much to do. So I'm down to about 2, maybe 3 hours a day now, but I'm trying to bring it down to about 1 or 2 hours.
And have you got any connection to this century? Are you managing to stay on top of news from this time?
Yeah, my wife's very instrumental in that. She's giving me all the hot topics.
Great. Well, thanks for being part of this today, and wish you luck with your continued endeavor reading from the Times Machine. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Great. And I now stop the